All right, yes, I'm ready. Yes, it's about major changes in the building of families that have occurred first in Northwestern Europe from the late 1960s and the 1970s onwards, and that are now spreading to the rest of Europe and even to other parts of the world. Around the 1960s, demographers were convinced that the classic family was a very stable one and that would just continue for the rest in history. And of course, that is never the case. Things do change, and they changed quite dramatically. And the variables that we are looking at, the features that we are looking at, are first of all, the postponement of all the transitions to adult life. That is, people form unions later in life, they get married much later in life, and they get their first child much later in life. So with this postponement, you get also a reduction in the number of children people finally get. And so there are countries where after the age of 30, women still catch up on their fertility, and other countries where the postponement does not lead to any catching up. And so you get very, very low fertility for a long time. So the second demographic transition postulated that we would be below replacement fertility, less than 2 children per couple. 2 people would not be replaced by 2 children, would be less than that. And that will be a structural feature, not just any wave connected to an economic crisis or anything. It will be a structural one. And that's the postponement part of the second demographic transition. The other segment is the nonconformist part, the non-conventional part of it. And that means that people, for instance, are starting to cohabit before they get married. They form a couple, they have a same dwelling, but they don't get married. The next step is they have their children without getting married. So that's fertility outside wedlock, outside matrimony. Other features that are typical for that are rises in divorce. People are no longer, of course, married forever in life. They make a calculus and an evaluation, and if it doesn't work anymore, they want to correct that. They want to have a divorce. Other features, people who are divorced are not likely to get remarried. They're likely to cohabit again. And the same thing is also true not only for younger people, but for older people. People who are divorced at older ages or who are widowed, they form lat relations. That means lat is an abbreviation for living apart together. They don't get married, they don't even share the same dwelling anymore. They are in a sexual union, they go on vacation together, they spend a lot of things together, but they don't form a legal union all over again. So all these features together are called the second demographic transition. The first demographic transition was also about a major innovation, and that was the control of fertility through contraception. That's a historical transition, and it was combined with a dramatic reduction in mortality. So this was really the big transition, the major transition. So if you go back in history, France and Catalonia were among the vanguard, the front runners in the first demographic transition, because they controlled fertility through not very efficient means of contraception, but compared to the rest of Europe, they had already quite a degree of control. And that is France already the case in the 18th century. By 1750, it's very clear. England, on the other hand, who was a pioneer in the Industrial Revolution, only had that control of fertility, that innovation within the family, so to speak. It only had it after 1880, when England was already a vastly industrial society. France did it, Catalonia did it without industrialization, without urbanization, without decline in infant mortality, even with declining standards of living. England did it with full-scale industrialization and with income levels per capita, income levels 3 times, 4 times higher than those that were prevalent in France a century and a half earlier. So that was a big innovation also within the family, the control of fertility through contraception. That was the first demographic transition. The second demographic transition is not so much anymore about efficiency of contraception, because we have the pill and all sorts of hormonal contraception. Although in a number of countries there are problems with teenagers. And that's predominantly the case in Anglo-Saxon countries. The new Europes, if you want to call them that way, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and especially the United States. But also in England, there you still have teenage levels of fertility, which are still in the first demographic transition because of a lack of efficient contraception. Continental Europe falls in another category. Our teenage fertility is very, very low.
In the future?
Oh, I think there are going to be 4 main domains. My own is going to be, how is the second demographic transition spreading to the rest of the world? And that's what I'm studying here with the colleagues at the UAB. I have also been looking at Japan, Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, and they have had postponements already for 30 years, but they did not have the cohabitation. And they always said that they did not going to have it, until of course they start asking the question for the first time in the survey, and it turned out, of course, that younger people started the union with cohabitation before they got married. So they are clearly moving towards the second demographic transition. The second big part of it is what is happening to Latin America. And what is documented is that they have had a boom in cohabitation. In areas where there was no cohabitation whatsoever, or very little, in the 1960s. Now it's up to 30–40% of unions start with cohabitation. In areas that had traditional cohabitation back in history, and were already at 30–40%, it's also increased to 50–60% of women cohabiting. So it's a universal phenomenon in every single Latin American country we have been looking at. But what is still missing is the postponement part of the second demographic transition. And I think this is going to come in as soon as larger number of women reach tertiary education, finish, pass their secondary education, move on to tertiary education, and then I think we are going to see also the postponement effect emerging in Latin America. The areas that are probably going to come much later would be the Arab-speaking, the Muslim part of the world, and the one who has not finished the first demographic transition, of course, which is sub-Saharan Africa. And that's very problematic for the moment, because the AIDS epidemic has stalled the first demographic transition. So that's a continent that really should be studied in its own right.